All right. Good morning, students. I hope I'm audible. Prateek, good morning. All right. So we were talking about the 19th century socio-religious reform movements, and among the different reformers, we had already talked about Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, and the Wahhabis. Next, we have Jyotiba Phule and his Satyasodhak Samaj. Now, what is Jyotiba Phule best known for? He is best known for his advocacy for the untouchables of India. He was the one, in fact, who coined the word Dalit for them. Dalit in the Marathi dialect, which Jyotiba Phule spoke, means the oppressed classes, right? Now, first we are going to deal with his thoughts. Now, he himself belonged to a low caste. He was born into a Mali family in Maharashtra near Pune. And from an early age, he came into contact with Christian missionaries. And because of the oppressive attitude of the Brahmanical class towards his caste and his close relationship with the Christian missionaries, he developed an anti-Brahmanical attitude. So, according to him, the Brahmins and the Aryan culture were responsible for the suffering of the untouchables. Not only did he have an anti-Brahmanical attitude, he even had an anti-Aryan attitude. In fact, he considered the Aryans to be invaders and the Shudras to be the original inhabitants of India. According to him, the Aryans were foreign invaders who had forcibly defeated and enslaved the Shudras. According to him, the Vedas contained the truth about these invasions and the subsequent enslavement of the Shudras. And that is why the Brahmins had deliberately kept them hidden, kept the Vedas hidden. From the Shudras, right? Because if the Shudras were to come to know about the story of their forcible enslavement, then they are going to definitely rebel. And that is why the Brahmins, in order to maintain their dominant position in the society, deliberately kept the truth hidden in the Vedas hidden from the Shudras. He further blames the Brahmins for keeping women uneducated and enslaved. Brahmins were accused of oppressing women as well. Now, in this scenario, there are two possible solutions. First of all, that the Shudras must be given access to Vedic education. They must be able to learn about the truth of their own predicament, and then they Brahmins and Shudras could work out their differences among themselves amicably. The other solution would be to completely discard the Aryan culture and the social hierarchy that had been instilled by it, that had been reinforced by it. Jyotiba Phule chose the second option. He said that the key to the emancipation of the oppressed was their empowerment. And how to empower an oppressed class, whether it is women or the Dalits, through modern scientific education and by engendering a class consciousness among them, that the oppressed classes must be made aware that they are not individually oppressed. Rather, as an entire class, they are oppressed. And once they are going to become conscious of their oppressed class status, then they are going to unite and demand further reforms. So this is going to lead to the development of a grassroots movements from the oppressed classes themselves, both the women as well as the Shudras, right? So this was the solution that he felt would be best suited given the long history of Brahmanical oppression, right? So ये हो गए इनके thoughts. Very quickly, let us write them down. लिखो. ज्योतिबा फूले was born into a low caste Mali family in 1828. So he belonged to the Mali caste, low caste Mali family in 1828. Further write down in the same point his personal experiences, comma, association with Christian missionaries, and education made him a critic of the Brahmanical society and Aryan culture. Next point. He argued that The Aryan invaders, had forcibly enslaved, the natives of India who were ascribed the status of Shudras. He argued that the Aryan invaders had forcibly enslaved the natives of India who were ascribed the status of Shudras. Full stop. This truth is contained within the Vedas, and thus Brahmins deliberately keep it hidden from the Shudras. Next point. He also accused the Brahmins of keeping women uneducated, and enslaved. Next point. Likho. According to him, the key to the emancipation of the oppressed, was their empowerment. Full stop. This was to be achieved through A and B. A, imparting modern scientific education to them, and B, engendering a class consciousness among them. Right? So these were his thoughts, ज्योतिबा फूले के. एक पॉइंट और लिख सकते हो. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट. Jyotiba Phule firmly believed that emancipation of the Dalits would not be possible within the confines of the Brahmanical Varna-based society. ठीक है? So he felt that the Varnashram Dharma system was beyond reform and a new path to emancipation was necessary. ठीक है? Next point. Therefore, a new path towards emancipation of the oppressed outside the Varna system was necessary. Was necessary. तो ये हो गए ज्योतिबा फूले के thoughts. He held the Brahmins and the Aryan culture responsible for the suffering of the untouchables of India. According to him, Aryans originally were invaders from foreign lands who had enslaved the natives of India and given them the status of Shudras. This truth is hidden in the Vedas, and that is why the Brahmins deliberately keep it hidden from the Shudras. According to him, Brahmins were also responsible for keeping women uneducated and enslaved. And the key to emancipating both women and the untouchables is to empower them by giving them, first of all, modern scientific education, since an illiterate mass of people can never become an agent for change. And secondly, by spreading class consciousness among them so that as a class they may demand reforms and improvement in their situation. Right. Next subheading, his contribution to social work and reform. His contribution to social work and reform. Write down. Jyotiba Phule was an advocate, of education and equality between the classes as well as men and women. Men and women. First of all, for women, क्या क्या किया इन्होंने? Write down. Number 1. In 1851, he and his wife, क्या नाम था इनकी वाइफ का? सावित्रीबाई फूले. सावित्रीबाई फूले started a girls' school at Pune. Started a girls' school at Pune. Next point, number 2. He was also a pioneer of widow remarriage. In Maharashtra. And started a widow's home for young widows at Pune. ठीक है? Next, for the untouchables, लिखो. He regularly petitioned the government to provide free and compulsory education to the lower castes through teachers drawn from the lower castes as well. So he wanted the children from the lower caste to be taught by teachers drawn from these castes as well, rather than upper caste teachers. Next point likho. In 1854, he became the first Indian to start a school for the untouchables. Start a school for the untouchables. Next likho. Number 3. In 1873, he established the Satyasodhak Samaj. He established the Satyasodhak Samaj as a reform organization. To attain equal rights for the lower castes and women. Full stop. Subpoint. Through this society, he was able to persuade government officials to grant the lower castes access to some public places and places of worship. Around Pune. ठीक है. Number 4 लिखो. Jyotiba Phule published a series of books, pamphlets, and articles to highlight the suffering of the Dalits and demand reform. These include ABCD करके लिख लो. दीन बंधु, in which he criticized the oppressive Aryan Vedic tradition. B. Gulamgiri. Gulamgiri, which compared the condition of India's Shudras to that of African slaves in America. C. Isara, which discusses the concerns of the agrarian classes. And D. Seta Karyancha Asud, which discusses the solutions to the peasants' problems. Okay? So these were his contributions to social reform and humanitarianism, social work. And finally, we have his legacy. So क्या है? What is the chief component of his legacy? That he was able to inspire a number of like-minded reformers. So he triggered a grassroots movements in some districts of Maharashtra and was able to inspire the next generation of reformers, both from the Dalit as well as the upper castes, to form a coalition for the rights of women and the depressed class. So write down. Jyotiba Phule succeeded in mobilizing a section of the Dalits and upper castes and a grassroots movement emerged in Maharashtra. Full stop. Next point. The late 19th and early 20th century witnessed a Dalit upsurge with a series of movements, societies, and protests being organized. Full stop. Same point में. Thus, Jyotiba Phule is credited with triggering the Dalit movement in Western India. in Western India. Next point. After his death, the mantle for Dalit emancipation, after his death, comma, the mantle for MANTLE, mantle for Dalit emancipation was picked up by the next generation, by the next generation of Dalit leaders, including Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, comma, Sri Narayan Guru, comma, E.V. Ramaswamy Periyar Naikar, E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar, also known as Periyar, etc. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. His educational mission also resulted in the emergence of a Dalit middle class, who led the charge of the Dalit movement within the wider national movement, full stop. This made the national movement more democratic, vibrant, and egalitarian. Next point. In fact, the very notion that historical injustices against the oppressed classes must be addressed was put forward by the Dalit movement. Full stop. Subpoint. Post independence, comma, this has resulted in positive outcomes, including the socio-economic upliftment of the Dalits through affirmative action. Affirmative action is another word for positive discrimination. Positive discrimination में हम कई सारी चीजों को इंक्लूड कर सकते हैं. फॉर एग्जाम्पल रिजर्वेशन इन मैटर्स ऑफ एजुकेशन और गवर्नमेंट एम्प्लॉयमेंट एटसेट्रा. राइट. तो क्या लिखा है अभी आपने? कैन यू रीड दैट सेंटेंस? Resulted in some positive outcomes from upliftment of the Dalits through affirmative action and removing the stigma traditionally associated with the lower castes to some degree. Traditionally associated with the lower castes to some degree. तो जो सोशल स्टिग्मा है ऑफ बीइंग लोअर कास्ट वो पूरी तरह से तो नहीं हट पाया है, बट एज कंपेयर्ड टू अर्लियर इट हैज बीन रिड्यूस्ड रिमार्केबली. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट फर्दर आगे लिखो इसी सब पॉइंट में. फर्दर comma by reducing the gap between the upper and lower castes comma the Dalit movement has also averted a possible social crisis and strife. ठीक है, full stop. In fact, the Dalit movement has been a major pillar towards the building of modern India. By diluting the parochial caste identity. ठीक है. So since the Dalit movement has ended in the legal abolition of untouchability, it has removed all barriers which were there for the Dalits in matters of education, public participation, employment, etc. Therefore, it has removed the visible markers of caste. It has also allowed the Dalits to emerge socially and economically as well. And in this sense, by diluting these differences, it has reduced the importance of caste at least to a great degree, if not completely so, right? आगे जाकर के बिल्कुल खत्म हो ही जाएगा, probably, right? And thus, by diluting the caste identity, रह क्या गया है? People of India है तो Indian identity रह गया. So this is why the Dalit movement is considered to be a major pillar in supporting the superstructure of modern India. ठीक है. शुरुआत कहाँ से होती है? ज्योतिबा फूले के मूवमेंट से होती है. So that is his grand legacy. तो ये हो गया Jyotiba Phule and the Satyasodhak Samaj. And finally we have Swami Vivekananda and the Ramakrishna mission. Swami Vivekananda and the Ramakrishna mission. Once again, सबसे पहले his thought. ठीक है. He was a disciple of Ramakrishna Paramhans. Who was Ramakrishna Paramhans? A priest at the Dakshineshwar temple of Calcutta. He was also a prominent Vedic scholar. Ramakrishna Paramhans, a priest, likho, a priest at the Dakshineshwar temple, Calcutta, at the, sorry, Dakshineshwar temple, Calcutta, and a Vedic scholar. ठीक है. सब पॉइंट लिखो. Ramakrishna Paramhans also founded the Belur Mutt and Ramakrishna movement at Calcutta with the objective of preparing a cadre of volunteers to spread the teachings of Vedant. ठीक है. And Swami Vivekananda was a pedigree of this mutt and this movement. So he was also one of the volunteers who had been trained by Ramakrishna Mission through his movement and mutt. Is this clear? And as a result, one of the core sources of his ideas are going to come from Vedant. ठीक है. Next point लिखो. Thus the philosophy of the Upanishads also known as Vedant, the philosophy of the Upanishads or Vedant was a chief source of inspiration for the thoughts of Swami Vivekananda. ठीक है. At the same time, Vivekananda was also an original thinker, and he believed that human beings are manifestations of the divine. Vivekananda was also convinced that human beings are manifestations of the divine. He gave the famous slogan, Yatra Jeev Tatra Shiv. क्या मतलब? Wherever there is any living being, there is Shiv. जहां पे man है वहां पे God है. And thus service to mankind is service to God. ठीक है? So this was Vivekananda's own brand of humanism, his humanitarian appeal. ठीक है? Next point लिखो. According to him, true salvation is not possible without the synchronization of the mind, body, and soul. True salvation is not possible without the complete synchronization of the mind, body, and soul. ठीक है? इंडियन सोसाइटी में प्रॉब्लम क्या था? That we were focusing exclusively upon the soul while neglecting the mind and body. However, the soul resides within the mind and the mind cannot be healthy with a robust body. Therefore, इनमें complete synchronization होना चाहिए. Write down sub point. According to him, Indians neglected material development in favor of spiritual development. In favor of spiritual development. Full stop. Thus, they suffered due to poverty. Next subpoint. On the other hand, the West was over materialistic and suffered due to lack of spiritual nourishment. ठीक है? तो सोल्यूशन क्या होगा? A conversation must be struck up between the east and west, between India and the west. वेस्ट को इंडिया से क्या सीखने को मिलेगा? स्पिरिचुअलिटी, और इंडिया को वेस्ट से मटीरियलिज्म. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट, मेन पॉइंट. Thus a civilizational and cultural exchange was necessary in which the West learns spirituality from India, and India adopts material development from the West. Adopts material development from the West. ठीक है, सब पॉइंट लिखो. Thus his teachings emphasized upon both Vedant as well as Western science. ठीक है, तो ये हो गए इनके थॉट्स. In fact, by claiming that Yatra Jiv Tatra Shiv, he has also fundamentally redefined the meaning of karma. Karma traditionally किसको माना जाता था? Performance of several rituals, performing pilgrimages, giving alms to priests, etc., charity, ये सब कर्मा माना जाता था. अब इन्होंने कर्मा को क्या रिडिफाइन कर दिया है? To physically, morally, mentally and intellectually train yourself so that you can become a better servant of mankind, and thus you will be automatically serving God to your fullest potential. You are not only going to perform your own personal duties towards mankind and God, but you will also prepare others to better serve mankind and God also. ठीक है, so in this way he completely redefined karma. Clear? ये पॉइंट भी आप लिख सकते हो. नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. स्वामी विवेकानंद completely redefined the meaning of karma, which traditionally stood for the performance of rituals, pilgrimages, charity and alms, ALMS, and alms, alms. ठीक है, full stop, sub point. His new definition of karma emphasized upon morally, physically, spiritually and intellectually preparing oneself to serve mankind, ठीक है। तो ये हो गए इनके थॉट्स। नाउ सेकेंडली, his contribution to humanitarianism and social work. Are his activities going to be limited only to India? No, because he wants to strike up a conversation and cultural exchange with the West. So write down, लिखो, Swami Vivekanand traveled extensively across India and the world. The point. Through his contact with the West, he was able to break several negative stereotypes regarding India, right? So Western consciousness had primarily been informed by the colonial narrative of India. और इंडिया के colonizers, the British, इंडिया को कैसे डिस्क्राइब करते थे to the Western audience? As a backward country, as a land of snake charmers and seers, as a country that is steeped in superstition, where there is no rationality, where there has never been any civilization, and a crippled society which needs the support of its Western masters. तो इस तरह के नेगेटिव स्टीरियोटाइप्स को स्वामी विवेकानंद through his encounters with Western scholars as well as lay people, through his speeches, addresses, articles, he was able to break them. Next point likho. He was able to export India's rich culture and philosophy to the West, including its greatest civilizational achievements, and generated tremendous goodwill towards Indians. ठीक है? Next sub point. At the World Parliament of Religions, 1893. This was held at Chicago. It was a religious conference in which scholars and leaders from various religious communities from across the world were present and they spoke. right? At the World Parliament of Religions, 1893, Swami Vivekananda delivered the Keystone Address. तो मेन स्पीच इन्हीं का था, उसको कीस्टोन स्पीच या कीस्टोन एड्रेस बोलते हैं. Delivered the Keystone Address and impressed the global audience with his articulate speech and elegant thought. With his articulate speech and elegant thought. Full stop. He made the case for a cultural exchange between the East and West, and emphasized upon the importance of humanitarian service, humanitarian service. So what was the general feeling that the audience walked away with after this address? तो एक बहुत प्रोमिनेंट रिलीजियस लीडर थे अमेरिका में बैप्टिस्ट चर्च के, उनसे पूछा गया. तो बिफोर दिस ही वाज अ ग्रेट सपोर्टर ऑफ द क्रिश्चियन मिशनरीज ऑफ इंडिया. उनको ऐसा लगता था कि पीपल ऑफ इंडिया नीड देयर स्पिरिचुअल गाइडेंस, देयर मॉरल गाइडेंस एटसेट्रा. बट ही केम अवे थिंकिंग दैट इफ India has people such as Swami Vivekananda, they do not need any external support. Rather, the West could benefit from missionaries such as him. So he was able to turn the tables. It was able to convince the West of their misconceptions, at least a major section of the West. ठीक है? Next main point लिखो. In 1897, he set up the Ramakrishna mission at Belur, Calcutta. To train a cadre of volunteers who would dedicate their lives towards humanitarian service. ठीक है? तो रामकृष्ण मूवमेंट और रामकृष्ण मिशन में डिफरेंस समझ में आया? Ramakrishna mission was designed to spread the message of Vedanta. Movement was designed to spread the message of Vedanta. Ramakrishna mission is designed to spread humanitarian service, to perform humanitarian service. Full stop. Sub point. Today, the mission operates hospitals, food banks, schools, libraries, ambulance services, widow homes, and community outreach centers in more than 34 countries. In more than 34 countries. Outreach centers in more than 34 countries, including the UK, the US, Pakistan, Burma, etc. ठीक है? So it does not look at geographical borders, religion, language, ये सब के ऊपर है ये मिशन. ठीक है? एंड बेसिक क्रीड क्या है इस मिशन का? टू परफॉर्म ह्यूमैनिटेरियन सर्विस. तो ये हो गया his contribution to humanitarian service and social work. And finally, his legacy. बताइए क्या है इनका चीफ कंपोनेंट लेगेसी का? हाँ, सो हिज रीडेफिनेशन ऑफ कर्मा, उसमें एक मैसेज छुपा हुआ था. क्या? कि दूसरों को सर्व करने से पहले यू नीड टू प्रिपेयर योरसेल्फ, यू नीड टू स्ट्रेंथन योरसेल्फ, राइट? सेकेंडली, हिज फिलॉसफी वाज डीपली रूटेड इन इंडियन कल्चर. एंड देश में कुछ पॉलिटिकल चेंजेस ऐसे हो रहे थे which made his philosophy extremely attractive to a section of young nationalists. नेशनलिज्म ऑलरेडी इमर्ज हो चुका था, कांग्रेस भी इमर्ज हो चुका था 1885 में. For the next 20 years, moderate phase chila. That had been quite ineffective, especially frustrating for the younger generation of nationalists. So they wanted a new ideology. These were going to be the extremists. Moderates were lovers of Western culture, Western ideology, Western liberalism. The younger generation wanted an Indian source of inspiration. And because of the specific qualities of Swami Vivekananda's message as well as its content, these values played a very important role or aligned themselves with the idea of Swaraj, which was the main demand of the extremist leadership. Swaraj stood for self-reliance, it stood for self-sufficiency, it stood for self-rule. तो यहाँ पे जो आत्मशक्ति का कॉन्सेप्ट है, दैट इज इनर स्ट्रेंथ, दैट वाज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. एंड स्वामी विवेकानंद का आइडिया ऑफ कर्मा क्या था? टू स्ट्रेंथन oneself morally, physically as well as intellectually. So this aligned itself with the extremist idea of Atma Shakti, which was expressed in a cogent way by Rabindranath Tagore. ठीक है? So that is why Swami Vivekananda's thought, because of its Indian roots and emphasis upon self-strengthening, played a very important role in inspiring the next generation of nationalists. सबसे पहले तो ये लिखो. Swami Vivekananda's teachings. Swami Vivekananda's teachings, which were heavily inspired by Indian tradition, attracted younger nationalists during the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Attracted young nationalists during the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Full stop. Subpoint. His emphasis upon self-strengthening, aligned itself with the extremist idea of Atma Shakti, of Atma Shakti, which stood for self-help, self-reliance, and self-rule at any cost. At any cost. ठीक है? Next. Now, unlike the other social reformers of his age who were trying to rid the society of various evils and problems, he believed that preaching to a hungry man itself is the greatest sin. So, first you take care of their basic needs, only then do you have the right to preach to them. And as a result, because his ideas were so relevant among the younger generation of nationalists, ये जो idea of service था, service to humanity, to mankind, that was adopted by the younger generation, and this resulted in the explosion of several humanitarian service organizations being organized by the younger nationalists. तो इसमें आप कई सारी organizations का नाम ले सकते हो, for example the Servants of India Society हो जाए या फिर even the RSS हो जाए, they were all working on the same lines as the Ramakrishna mission. Write down. Swami Vivekananda emphasized that preaching to the hungry is a sin. Full stop. It is more important to provide them basic relief and dignity. Full stop. Sub point. This message also resonated strongly. This message also resonated strongly with the younger nationalists, who were already looking for ways to engage the masses, ठीक है? तो यंगर जनरेशन ऑफ नेशनलिस्ट एक्सट्रीमिस्ट जो थे वो मास पार्टिसिपेशन में बिलीव करते थे. दे वांटेड टू मोबिलाइज द मासेस एंड देयर कम्युनिटी आउटरीच प्रोग्राम, रिलीफ वर्क्स एक्सेट्रा वुड ब्रिंग देम फेस टू फेस विद द मासेस. ठीक है? सो दैट इज व्हाट वी हैव addressed. So they were already looking for ways to engage the masses. Full stop. Next point. Thus, a number of humanitarian organizations emerged within the umbrella or emerged under the umbrella of the national movement itself. ठीक है? And finally, national movement itself. And finally, देखो इस समय हवा चल रही थी आर्य समाज की, राइट? आर्य समाज was pushing forward a very dangerous ideology, that is Hindutva, and that was countered by Swami Vivekananda, who put forward the idea of neo-Hinduism. So he was able to take back ownership of Hinduism from the Hindutva lobby. Hindutva lobby essentially divisive था, न्यू हिंदुइज्म एक्सक्लूसिव था, कॉस्मोपॉलिटन था, मोर ह्यूमेन था, राइट? वेयर एज द हिंदुत्व आइडियोलॉजी वाज रिजल्टिंग इन कॉन्फ्लिक्ट, न्यू हिंदुइज्म वाज सर्चिंग फॉर ways to overcome the social, geographical and even national divisions between people, right? So that is why ये जो version of Hinduism था, that was more readily acceptable not only to the bulk of Indians but also to outsiders, right? Write down. Finally, main point. Finally, Swami Vivekananda was able to present a more humane, a more humane, egalitarian, inclusive, and cosmopolitan face of Hinduism, face of Hinduism in the form of neo-Hinduism. Finally, Swami Vivekananda was able to present a more humane, egalitarian, inclusive and cosmopolitan face of Hinduism in the form of neo-Hinduism as compared to in the form of neo-Hinduism as compared to the dangerous and divisive ideology of Hindutva. A dangerous and divisive ideology of Hindutva. ठीक है? तो ये हो गए the various individuals and their institutions associated with the 19th century reform movements. And finally हमें क्या डिस्कस करना है? Their impact or significance. तो किसी भी मेजर डेवलपमेंट के पॉजिटिव एंड नेगेटिव एक्सटर्नैलिटीज होंगे ही होंगे. So first of all, the positive impact that they had. तो क्या मेजर अचीवमेंट्स थे इन सोशल रिलीजियस रिफॉर्मर्स के? They were not only able to highlight the problems prevalent in Indian society, the various social evils, but they were also able to provide certain solutions. ठीक है? By doing this, at least to a certain degree, they were able to reduce the divisions within the Indian society, create greater unity. In their desire to counter the colonial narrative regarding the uncivilized Indian society, they delved into India's past and rediscovered India's glorious past. Fourthly, they were also able to weaken the ideological justification given by the colonial scholars for the continuation of British rule. They were arguing that British rule is necessary in India in order to uplift the oppressed sections of the society. But since the Indians were now addressing these problems themselves, they weakened the justification for colonial rule. Further, since they were trying to discover a glorious Indian past and a glorious Indian culture, they were able to revive several art forms which had been lost to Indians. And these art forms emerged as new cultural symbols, which were co opted by the nationalist leadership and transformed into patriotic symbols of India. Right? So, new national culture, symbols, and art were created by them. And finally, they were able to come up with entirely new narratives, new definitions of things such as womanhood belonging to a lower caste in India. And thus, they contributed to the creation of a completely new, modern, and vibrant Indian identity. Okay? And as a result, because of all these developments, it would not be wrong to consider these reform movements as being the trigger or as being the basis for the social and cultural foundations of Indian nationalism, for providing the social and cultural foundations of Indian nationalism. ठीक है, ये तो हो गए पॉजिटिव एस्पेक्ट्स. What were the negative aspects, limitations of these 19th century social religious reform movements? क्या थे? First of all, ये मूवमेंट्स किसने शुरू किए, कहाँ पे शुरू किए? Primarily upper caste men. They were trying to address the problems being faced by the lower caste and women, not only in the cities but also in the villages. In the villages primarily, क्योंकि वहां पे situation सबसे ज्यादा खराब थी. But did these movements involve active participation of those groups जिनके problems ये address करने की कोशिश कर रहे थे? No. So they were elite and urban movements with little participation from the lower castes, the rural communities and women. और क्या प्रॉब्लम था इसके साथ? Did did the bulk of these movements ever actually try to engage directly the groups that they were trying to address, or were they interested only in changing the social attitudes of the oppressor class? सोशल एटीट्यूड्स ऑफ द डोमिनेंट क्लासेस को ये चेंज करना चाह रहे थे. दैट इज इट. दे नेवर स्टार्टेड अ डायरेक्ट कॉन्वर्सेशन विद द लोअर कास्ट और द women. They were kept, they were treated as outsiders, they were treated as mute spectators to the process of their own emancipation. तो उनको पार्टिसिपेशन का कभी मौका नहीं मिला. So they never tried to engage the beneficiaries of these reforms. Rather, the reform movements were always oriented towards the elite classes only. It was their outlook and attitudes that these movements were trying to change. Right? And finally, ever since the very beginning, there was a strong undercurrent of cultural nationalism. When I say cultural nationalism, read religious nationalism within these movements, right? So they were not simple social reform movements, rather they were socio-religious reform movements. To a certain extent, this element was an outcome of the basic nature of these movements, but because movements were either going to be Hindu nationalist movements or Muslim nationalist movements, it led to the development of communal feelings among both the Hindu as well as Muslim communities. ठीक है. इनफैक्ट कई सारे प्यूरिटैनिकल मूवमेंट्स भी इसमें इन्वॉल्व थे, कई सारे डेंजरस मूवमेंट्स भी इन्वॉल्व थे, कंट्रोवर्शियल मूवमेंट्स भी इन्वॉल्व थे. So although they provided the cultural and social foundations of Indian nationalism, because it was heavily tinged with religious nationalism, the feeling of uh, religious communities or communal nationalism, therefore Indian nationalism itself was from the very beginning tinged with the hues of religious nationalism, and this was divisive. It was going to harm the interests of an all India secular movement. So these were the negative externalities. तो जल्दी से इसको लिख लेते हैं, फिर आगे बढ़ेंगे. हेडिंग दो, इम्पैक्ट और सिग्निफिकेंस. राइट डाउन. पहला सब हेडिंग इसमें पॉजिटिव एस्पेक्ट्स और सक्सेस. लिखो. The 19th century reformers highlighted the burning social issues of the age and started movements across India to address them. Full stop. Sub point. They were able to prompt government action and reform legislations were introduced. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट, their efforts helped to heal the fractures that had been keeping Indian society divided, and backward, keeping Indian society divided and backward. Full stop, sub point. In other words, they propelled India towards greater unity and modernity. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट पॉइंट, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट, they made a comprehensive study of the Indian past, in order to counter the negative colonial propaganda full stop, sub point. This investigation revealed a glorious past that was in no way inferior to the West. Full stop, sub point. By next इसी में सब पॉइंट लिखो, नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट. By shattering the myth of Western superiority, they emboldened Indian patriots and gave them a sense of pride. Next point, main point. These reformers also helped weaken the colonial justification for ruling India. Sub point. The colonial scholars had been arguing that British rule is necessary for protecting the marginalized sections such as women, tribals, and the lower castes. Women, tribals, and the lower castes. Full stop. Next sub point. By addressing the issues, of these groups, comma, the reformers weakened the case of colonialism. ठीक है. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट. हाँ, मेन पॉइंट. while searching for a superior national culture, they revived India's lost art forms. Which emerged as prominent elements of the new national culture, symbolism, and art. New national culture, symbolism, and art. We are talking about art forms such as architecture, dance, music, painting, etc. They were co-opted by the nationalists. Okay? For example, Indian paintings now became more popular among the intelligentsia as compared to European paintings. उसमें Indian themes भी होंगे, Indian style जो ancient और medieval styles हैं वो भी employ किया जाएगा. जो बड़े बड़े लोगों के घर होते थे पहले विक्टोरियन आर्किटेक्चर के ऊपर बेस्ड होते थे. नाउ दे आर गोइंग टू बी बेस्ड ऑन traditional Indian architecture. These kinds of things. Next point लिखो. These reformers also evolved new ideas of caste and womanhood which became part of the new Indian identity. ठीक है. तो हर कल्चर, हर सिविलाइजेशन का जो नेशनल या सिविलाइजेशनल आइडेंटिटी होता है उसमें रोल्स ऑफ डिफरेंट ग्रुप्स आर असाइंड. सो व्हाट आर दे एक्सपेक्टेड टू डू, व्हाट इज देयर कैरेक्टर. फॉर एग्जांपल वुमेन का क्या कैरेक्टर होगा, उनका क्या ईथोस होगा, व्हाट आर द वैल्यूज दैट ड्राइव देम. तो इंडिया में women and the lower castes had been oppressed classes. So they constituted a silent section or subservient section of the Indian population जिनका कोई prominent role नहीं था. But now, as new definitions of womanhood and caste emerged, the definition of India, the identity of India as a whole changed. It emerged as a more progressive, more vibrant and egalitarian society, a more confident society. ठीक है. So that is what it means. Next main point लिखो. On the whole, it would not be incorrect to say that The 19th century socio-religious reform movements. The 19th century socio-religious reform movements laid the social and cultural foundations of Indian nationalism. Laid the social and cultural foundations of Indian nationalism. ठीक है, तो ये हो गए positives. Now negatives or limitations. Negatives or limitations. लिखो. Most of these movements were urban in character and had little impact on India's vast rural landscape. On India's vast rural landscape. Next point. They were elite-led movements with limited social base. With limited social base. The point. Therefore, the intended beneficiaries of these reforms, were treated lower caste and women of these reforms were treated as mute spectators to their own emancipation. ठीक है, एंड ऐसे सिनारियो में प्रोग्रेस ज्यादा होगा या कम होगा? कम होगा, बिकॉज जो मूवमेंट को क्रिटिकल मास चाहिए और जो एनर्जी चाहिए वो तो लोअर क्लासेस ऑप्रेस क्लासेस से मिलना था, लेकिन वो इन्वॉल्व ही नहीं है, तो इफेक्टिवनेस भी इसका कम होगा. नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो. Instead, the majority of these movements tried to transform the attitudes of the dominant sections. Full stop. No attempt was made to develop class consciousness among the oppressed classes, or engage them directly. Full stop. Naturally, their effectiveness remained limited. लिमिटेड। ठीक है, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो। फ्रॉम द वेरी बिगनिंग, फ्रॉम द वेरी बिगनिंग, there was a strong undercurrent, there was a strong undercurrent of cultural slash religious nationalism, cultural or religious nationalism within these movements, within these movements. Full stop. This resulted in the subtext, in the subtext of communal nationalism, this resulted in the subtext of communal nationalism becoming an inherent part of Indian nationalism, of Indian nationalism. Full stop. Sub point. This weekend, unity within the national movement and caused a religious division, ठीक है, तो ये हो गया रिलीजियस डिविजन, ये हो गया impact of these reform movements. Take down a question. Discuss the factors responsible for the emergence of the Indian Renaissance. Was it truly the real beginning of Indian nationalism? Question mark. 200 words, 15 marks. Was it truly the beginning of Indian nationalism? क्वेश्चन समझ में आया है? दो पार्ट्स में एड्रेस करना है. First, you need to highlight the factors responsible for the 19th century socio-religious reform movements. क्या factors थे? Consciousness of defeat to a Western power and rising contact with the West equipped Indian scholars, the Indian middle class intelligentsia, to conduct a comparative analysis, and they recognize the weaknesses of the Indian society and culture. Thus, there was a drive to reform it in order to address the challenge posed by the West. तो ये तो हो गया main factor. Should it truly be considered to be the real beginning of Indian nationalism? Yes. कैसे हम बोल सकते हैं? Because it created the social and cultural foundations of Indian nationalism by addressing various social evils, by creating greater unity, by giving us a sense of pride, by countering and weakening the negative colonial propaganda, by weakening the justification for colonial rule, by creating new cultural symbols, new national symbols, and by creating a new Indian identity. However, इसमें कुछ limitations भी थे जिसका खामियाजा हमें भुगतना पड़ा because of their elite and urban character, because of the treatment of the intended beneficiaries of reforms as silent spectators to the process of their own emancipation. Effectiveness remained limited, social base remained narrow, progress remained slow. Therefore, the creation of greater national unity was also affected, slowed down. Secondly, because from the very beginning reform movements में एक trend of cultural nationalism present था, तो Indian nationalism which was a result of this reform movements also inherited this phenomena, and this resulted in the division of the national movement as a whole along sectarian lines, चाहे वो religious sects हो, चाहे linguistic sects हो, चाहे regional sects हो, चाहे caste का sect हो, right? So that is why while Indian nationalism का ये true beginning माना जा सकता है, but it also needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. Clear? So that is what you are going to write. ये हो गए 19th century socio-religious reform movements. Next, the emergence of Indian nationalism we have already discussed ना, हमने क्लास में कर लिया था before the anti-colonial revolts. Next we have the formation of the Indian National Congress. When was it established? In 1885. Who was the founder? कौन था? A retired British civil servant. नाम? Alan Octavian Hume. A.O. Hume. First session कब हुआ था? In 1885 December. कहां पर? At Bombay. Sir गोकुलदास तेजपाल संस्कृत महाविद्यालय at Bombay. Total how many Congress members were there in this session? 72 members attended this session, coming from all parts of India. The bulk of them were lawyers, but there were a large number of other professionals such as doctors, educators, journalists, etc. also. They were presided over by वोमेश चंद्र बनर्जी. ठीक है? Notable Indian leaders who were not present at the first session. कौन कौन नहीं present था? The two most prominent leaders of the national movement at that point of time were not part of this session. These included Surendranath Banerjee and Anand Mohan Bose. ठीक है? The foundation of the Congress is considered to be the true beginning of the Indian national movement. ठीक है? क्यों ऐसा माना जाता है इसको ट्रू बिगिनिंग ऑफ द इंडियन नेशनल मूवमेंट? Because the Congress was an all India political party, rather a platform which had participation from nationalists across India. तो nationalist organization था. It led the charge from its inception right up to independence against the colonial regime. So it was distinctly anti-colonial and played an instrumental role in India's ultimate liberation. It sought to and succeeded in representing the interests of all classes of Indians. So it was a secular organization which represented the interests of all Indians, irrespective of class, language, or region. It was the Congress which gave the early direction to the Indian national movement and resulted in the adoption of a democratic republican form of government after independence. तो जो core values थे national movement के, they were enshrined and protected within the ethos of the Congress as a whole. So it was a democratic, liberal, and progressive platform with an inclusive agenda rather than an undemocratic, conservative, and regressive platform with a divisive agenda. And post independence, it was the Congress which provided stewardship to newly independent India or young India in accordance with the values of the national movement. Since the national movement itself stood for two parallel processes: nation building and the evolving demands of Indians vis-a-vis British rule. national struggle. The Congress, acting as the leader of the national movement as well as its greatest advocate, also emerged as an agent for both these processes. Thus, the foundation of the Congress is considered to be the true beginning of the Indian national movement. क्लियर है? इसको लिखवाने की जरूरत है? नहीं? आगे बढ़े? Now, since the Congress would go on to play such a crucial role in the national struggle, the question of its formation has invited a great degree of attention from both colonial as well as nationalist historians. कॉलोनियल हिस्टोरियंस क्या कोशिश करेंगे? कांग्रेस को पॉजिटिव लाइट में दिखाने का या उसको क्रिटिसाइज करने का? क्रिटिसाइज करने का. एंड नेशनलिस्ट हिस्टोरियंस आर ऑलवेज गोइंग टू ट्राई एंड डिफेंड इट. ठीक है? सो देयर इज अ डिबेट with respect to formation of the Congress. दो पहलू हैं यहां पर. फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, we have the colonial perspective, according to which the Congress was created deliberately by the British as a safety valve to protect the British Raj against any major rebellion like the Great Revolt of 1857. This is also known as the safety valve theory. ठीक है? Now, the colonial perspective, the safety valve theory is based upon the writings of Lala Lajpat Rai. लाला लाजपत राय ने 1916 में एक किताब लिखी, यंग इंडिया, in which he was deeply critical of the Congress. By this point of time, he had left the Congress and established the Hindu Mahasabha. And Young India में इन्होंने कांग्रेस को डिस्क्राइब किया है एज अ सेफ्टी वॉल्व that was deliberately created by the British. While characterizing the Congress as a safety valve, Lala Lajpat Rai has depended upon the writings of William Wedderburn. अब ये कौन थे? Like A.O. Hume, the founder of the Congress, he was also a retired civil servant, British civil servant. He was a close personal friend of A.O. Hume. He had even served as a one-time president of the Congress and was the biographer of A.O. Hume. And in his biography of A.O. Hume, he has claimed that Hume had created the Congress as a safety mechanism. He has described Hume as an enlightened imperialist. Who was concerned about the future of the British rule because he was convinced of the vast groundswell of anger against the British that was present among the Indian people. He writes that while Hume was posted as a finance official at Shimla in the revenue department, he was receiving secret reports from his vast network of spies across India, which had convinced him that British rule in India was in danger, and another major uprising like the Great Revolt of 1857 was imminent. Therefore, Hume got into contact with the British Governor General at that point of time, Con Dufferin. And Dufferin was the one who suggested that Hume should get into touch with Indian nationalist leaders and bring them onto a common platform. Thus, according to Wedderburn, the Congress was the brainchild of the Governor General himself. Idea क्या था? That through the Congress, the Indians would be able to vent their anger in a controlled manner, in a peaceful manner. And वो जो pressure है anger का, that is never going to build up to a critical limit which is going to cause an explosion. जैसे pressure cooker में safety valve होता है which safely lets the steam escape, उसी तरह का रोल कांग्रेस परफॉर्म करेगा अकॉर्डिंग टू विलियम वेडरबर्न, जिसने बोला कि ये डफरिन का ऐसा मानना था. And acting on the instructions of Dufferin, A.O. Hume laid the foundations of the Congress. Is this much clear? Now, nationalist historians have obviously rejected this. Nationalist perspective क्या है? That rather than being used as a safety valve to protect the British, the nationalist leadership of that period had very wisely used A.O. Hume as a lightning conductor. To shield the Congress, which was still in its infancy, from repression from a hostile government. According to them, the Congress was actually the manifestation of the maturity of Indian nationalism. ठीक है? These historians point out that since the late 1830s, a series of regional political organizations had come up in India, and they were all interested in advocating the rights of Indians versus the British regime. These were active not only in different parts of India, but even active overseas. So some nationalist leaders had opened their own organizations in England to advocate for the rights of Indians, to convince the British public as well as political opinion of the need for reform. And by the 1880s, there was a greater appetite for common action between these various regional leaders. In 1883, the Indian Association of Calcutta had Indian Association of Calcutta, which had been founded by Surendranath Banerjee and Anand Mohan Bose, it had launched its Indian National Conference. And at the time of the creation of the Indian National Congress, the founders of the National Conference, that is Surendranath Banerjee and Anand Mohan Bose, were touring different parts of India, convincing the various nationalist leaders to join their conference, to come onto a common platform. So, अगर कांग्रेस नहीं भी बना होता, chances were great that another alternative platform led by Indians, created by Indians, would have emerged. Okay? And it was the nationalist leadership who had to make a choice. या तो कॉन्फ्रेंस या फिर कांग्रेस. जो कॉन्फ्रेंस था, that was being founded, that had been founded by Bose and Banerjee. For their time, they were considered to be radical Indian leaders. They had vehemently opposed Lytton's acts, the 3 controversial acts of 1878. Right? So they were seen as staunch enemies of the British. On the other hand, the Congress was created by A.O. Hume. तो नेशनलिस्ट लीडरशिप ने बोला कि अगर हम कॉन्फ्रेंस ज्वाइन कर लेते हैं तो अंग्रेज हमको जिंदा नहीं छोड़ेंगे. दे आर गोइंग टू क्रैक डाउन अपॉन अस immediately. Rather, let us join the Congress, which had been created by a retired British civil servant. तो अगर ब्रिटिश रिप्रेशन की बिजली कड़कती भी है कांग्रेस के ऊपर, ह्यूम इज गोइंग टू एक्ट एज अ lightning conductor, safely passing the charge, transmitting the charge to the ground while protecting the nationalist leadership. So, the nationalists had in fact used Hume as a lightning conductor. ठीक है? फर्दर, गवर्नमेंट पेपर्स जब बनाए जाते हैं तो उनको अलग अलग कैटेगराइजेशन दिया जाता है. कुछ को कॉन्फिडेंशियल, कुछ को सीक्रेट, कुछ को टॉप सीक्रेट, कुछ को ओपन. तो जो गवर्नमेंट पेपर्स थे रिगार्डिंग ऑफ दिस पीरियड, दैट इज द कॉरेस्पॉन्डेंस बिटवीन ए.ओ. ह्यूम एंड डफरिन and Dufferin and the governor of Bombay, they were given the categorization of top secret. तो top secret governments को declassify करने का अपना एक प्रोसीजर होता है. कई बार 50 साल लगते हैं, 60 साल लगते हैं, 70 साल लगते हैं. After independence, all the papers of this era were declassified, और उन declassified documents से एक completely different reality झलकती है. क्या दिखता है? That Dufferin was neither involved in the creation of the Congress, nor did he favor the creation of the Congress. In fact, he was deeply suspicious of the activities of Hume. ठीक है? And therefore, would it be correct to call him the real mastermind behind the Congress? नहीं. Secondly, कुछ और फ्लॉज पॉइंट आउट किए हैं नेशनलिस्ट हिस्टोरियंस ने. दैट लाला लाजपत राय का जो ओपिनियन है उसको हम ऑब्जेक्टिव नहीं मान सकते हैं. व्हाई? बिकॉज ही हैड लेफ्ट द कांग्रेस बाय द टाइम दैट ही रोट द यंग इंडिया एंड हैड क्रिएटेड अ competing political organization, the All India Hindu Mahasabha, and thus his writings were not objective. And thirdly, विलियम वेडरबर्न का जो नैरेटिव है that can also not be taken at face value. Wedderburn was a close personal friend of A.O. Hume and as well as his biographer, right? So in the long run, the creation of the Congress would prove to be harmful for the health of the British Empire. So Wedderburn wanted to showcase A.O. Hume in a positive light. He wanted to shield his friend from the guilt of creating the greatest tool against British imperialism. And thus, his narrative also lacked objectivity. Further, as Wedderburn himself admits that A.O. Hume was in fact a revenue official. ठीक है, और जो सीक्रेट रिपोर्ट्स, इंटेलिजेंस रिपोर्ट्स होती हैं, वो क्या रेवेन्यू ऑफिशियल्स को मिलती हैं? नहीं मिलती हैं। किसको मिलती हैं? होम गवर्नमेंट के ऑफिशियल्स को, राइट? होम मिनिस्ट्री के ऑफिशियल्स को। तो he had no access to intelligence reports, and thus the very basis of Wedderburn's arguments is not well founded. ठीक है? So on the basis of these facts, हम क्या कंक्लूड कर सकते हैं? Had A.O. Hume created the Congress to act as a safety wall to protect the British rule? उसके हिसाब से तो उसका यही काम था, उसने किया था, राइट? सो इन और Hume's motives, Hume's intention may have been to use the Congress as a safety wall but ultimately it was Hume himself who was used as a lightning conductor by the Indian nationalist leadership. ठीक है? And finally, proof is in the pudding that had the Congress actually been a safety valve, would it have achieved all the things that it did? No. So Congress ultimately emerged as the strongest critic and opponent of the British Raj and led a lengthy and sustained struggle against it till independence. Thus, it hardly behaved as a safety valve. It did not behave as a safety valve. समझ में आया? Take down a question. To what extent do you believe that the safety valve theory explains the formation of the Indian National Congress? Question mark. 200 words, 15 marks. To what extent do you believe that the safety valve theory explains the formation of the Congress? ओके हो जाएगा ये ठीक है तो फॉर्मेशन ऑफ द कांग्रेस हमने एड्रेस कर लिया है नेक्स्ट क्लास में कल की क्लास में हम मॉडरेट्स एक्सट्रीमिस्ट ये सब शुरू करेंगे वेरियस फेजेस ऑफ द नेशनल मूवमेंट राइट सम नोट्स आई विल ट्राई टू सेंड यू बाय दिस इवनिंग तो कोशिश करिएगा कि पढ़ के आए सो दैट आवर टास्क वुड बी स्मूथर ऑलराइट चलिए देन इफ देयर आर नो डाउट शैल आई एंड दिस सेशन कोई डाउट्स तो नहीं है गाइस ऑलराइट थैंक यू